and find a way to just got it. Yeah, I just wanted a way to get past names. So,
Okay, cool.
but this kind of sets it up nicely, I hope. So in this person opening up and sharing basically just some of the things they want to address or I guess examine in their lives, reflect on, better understand. It gave me an opportunity to share my own experience of it pre my falling down and everything I've learned about it since. And the way that I opened up to this person was by starting to describe sort of what's going on with his nervous system. And I guess the most relatable point is to start from the beginning. So we all have our sort of original traumas that we're carrying around to different degrees of effect as far as their impact on us, right, as we get older. So for
Let's
those that have,
let's pause for a second. So what is a trauma?
so traumas can be anything, I would say anything that can be remembered or not necessarily remembered, like with a clear memory, but something that was some like an original hurt or an injury that has potentially long lasting effects and impacts on one's, nervous system and psycho emotional processing.
So some kind of jolt
A jolt.
that
Yeah.
somebody had at some point in
Yeah. And
their
that
life.
could instill a sense of fear or insecurity, lack of safety, danger. There can be a lot of different associations with it as well. Now, again, this isn't an original premise. I've read about this in different works from Levine to Mate, but talking about how these traumas then can get kind of locked up in the body. And what I mean by that is that, especially at the most vulnerable point of our life, when we're babies, when we have absolutely no control over a situation, but our will to try to get what we want. In that time in particular, I think there's a lot that can happen that you might not ever really even be able to remember, right? But they can have long-lasting impacts on your developing nervous system and kind of get locked up in there. Not kind of, but get jammed up in there. And then my understanding, my own experience of it as time goes on, as you live your daily experience, you can have things that will remind you of that original traumatic situation, right? As if there's like a ready-made story kind of bouncing around in your head that matches up situationally with something happening in real time. And that original sense of fear or insecurity, sense of danger can pop up in the moment suddenly because it's being projected onto the situation that's happening presently, which then brings us to what we call triggers. So that is the trigger mechanism. So basically, the body's interpreting the situation that's happening as if it's this originally dangerous situation.
So it's a
Familiar sense of danger or
familiar,
anger or
familiar,
fear.
familiar mix of body sensations, thoughts,
Yeah, thoughts,
or
especially
even thoughts.
particularly thoughts and or narrative, right? The story structure, because so my own experience of triggers. So it comes up in the body in relation to an interpretation of the situation that I'm in. The interpretation of the situation is the interpretation I'm putting on it. This person's acting a certain way, and I'm reading into it to align with the sense of danger, that sense of familiarity with the danger that I'm feeling. And it's through my interpretation, right? So the story that I'm putting on this situation, this person's doing this to try to hurt me, right? And that's also another really like an interesting feature of the language. It's people caught up in this cycle. Again, I'm speaking from my own perspective. People caught up in this cycle are quick to attribute this uncomfortable feeling to something external, usually another person. This person makes me feel this way. This situation makes me feel this way, right? And it's not recognizing that actually I'm feeling this way, reminded of something else, and making that connection internally. So yeah,
so another person could be right beside them, experiencing the same exact events from an external observer, and not be feeling that at all.
viewing, yeah, basically having a completely different interpretation or read of what's going on. More often than not, for the people on their way to anger management, the other people seeing the response of the person who's quick to anger or just reaction, whatever it may be, outburst, fight or flight, right? It's basically the fight or flight response coming up. And they're trying to remove themselves from this dangerous situation or confront it head on as if it's a threat that they're trying to push away.
Which will still have the desired effect of changing the sensation.
Discharging it one way or another. Yeah.
Right.
And it's the adrenaline. It's basically the adrenaline, right? It's life or death.
Right.
So at least they feel like they're doing something about it. Now, the other people now on the other receiving end of that are going, what the hell is this person so angry about? Because they don't see it coming, right? Because they don't see the interpretation that the other person's putting on it. They just see the angry outburst.
And they may have their own trauma that triggers.
Well, which is when you get that one-upping all the way, right? The standoffishness, because now the person, I mean, if someone comes at you and you detect aggression, you're going to have a nervous system response going danger, 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 and then you're going to go one up to try to match that energy, right?
And also it may match. This was like when my father or whatever, whoever was angry.
Yeah, exactly. So then they might shrink in response.
Yeah.
They could get the hell out of there in response, or they could fight back, right? Which, again, in my own experience, I gravitated towards like, all right, let's go, bring it. Like, let's see how far we can go with this.
Yes.
I wouldn't do that physically. I was not a physical type person that way, but I acted out my anger in different ways, and it was usually trying to psychologically unwind someone, dismantle them.
Yes.
So yeah, that said, back to the nervous system. Okay, so now when there are these other instances, so like again, I was talking about these sort of degrees of trauma that people carry, and it's not like no two traumas are alike or equal, right? People are impacted differently and on different at different levels, right? They can carry trauma and the effects of it. So let's say someone who just got like a heavy dose of yelling and screaming and anger as a child, right? Maybe even pre-memory. That could be pretty heavily loaded into the system. Parents may have even reformed a bit afterwards, right? Or thereafter, but there could still be lasting impacts of those formative years when you're just getting blasted. And this can, so like I said, it's like a load on the nervous system that you carry into adulthood. And this is where narrative in my, again, like my understanding of this is, as I've gone through it and experienced it, studied it, and taken apart my own story. But there seems to be a relationship to the narrative and the body holding on to the trauma, right? The how it's tied up in the body. And or the narrative is just an indication that you're interpreting your constant outbursts and stuff like that. It's like, well, it's just, you know, because of X, Y, and Z that happened to me. That's why I am the way I am.
So maybe say more about narrative, because you're using that term a lot. People know what you're talking about.
Okay, so when I'm speaking of narrative, I'm talking about the story of oneself. It's like the story that I tell myself as to who I am. So like my term, I don't know if I coined it or not, so I'm just gonna qualify that now, but like narrative identity is how I like to describe it. Is the term I like to use to name it. So narrative identity is like taking all my memories of experiences and then having stories about those memories. Like, oh, there was this, and this situation when I was a child, and this is what happened. And I'm not looking at it from the level of like, well, this is how I experienced it. And when I talked to them later on, I found out this is how they experienced it. And it was really quite different. That's not it. It's the narrative identity as well. This happened to me. This is what I did in that situation. And that's an indication of my character, of who I am as a person. By the time I get to the next significant memory or situation, right, I'm like, oh, well, I remember these 2 or 3 other things led to that point, and that got me to here. And that's why I decided at that moment that I was going to behave this way, and I let that person have it because it was their fault.
Is there any chance that you can like give examples in it?
Can I give examples? Yeah.
Yeah, right. Because it still seems a little bit abstract.
Okay, good. Good to identify that. I was not expecting my parents to call me in the middle of it.
You should have. If our ears are just really, really hot.
Burn.
You're talking about your childhood trauma again?
Right. Okay. So let's just go to that. So
Okay.
that's an example of my narrative.
Right.
Okay. So there are the stories oh my God. There are the stories that I heard about my life before I have any memory of experiencing my life. So for instance, being born, I got stuck in the birth canal and the doctor had to reach in and pull me out. And in the process, ended up breaking my collarbone. And then in the process of healing, my collarbone was rebroken. And then somehow my other collarbone was broken afterwards. And there's a series of other things. So those are the things I don't remember, but I've heard stories about. They're the things I start to remember, and I remember like the conflicts. I remember my, hiding out and crying. I remember being bullied, and I remember specific situations with confrontations with my parents or being shamed or being, and these all start like, I think before I ever had a chance to unpack any of this, I internalized all of this stuff. So based on the memories I had and the sense of shame I felt in the moment, just, as the situation was handled, I internalized this stuff. And, oh, I'm really bad, or I'm a lousy person. Or just the opposite, right? Like I humiliated this person in public, and somehow that made me really strong and impressive. Um, so those became features of my identity, right? Each time I experienced one of those things, and say, oh, there's another example of that thing about me. That's how I am. That's who I am. And then over time, like these things, because I'm stuck in that narrative of who I am and identifying with those things, they kind of start to fester. Like they become like an entrenchment, or like a well-worn rut that a vehicle's been driving over again and again, and then the tires just start spinning in it.
Is there also kind of, because there's such a focus on those, that
Mhm.
though there's almost a filter, that's what gets pulled out of experience and out of
Yeah, I would say that exactly. I'd say that's a way more succinct way of saying everything I just said. But that's
that. Okay.
no, I mean it. I mean it. Because it becomes your lens. It becomes the lens through which you see the world. So if I'm feeling like a piece of garbage, like if
Yeah.
I'm self-loathing, then I'm not worthy. Then anything that comes along in my experience that feels like love, or that feels like caring or vulnerability, well, I'm not worthy of that. So that's got to be manipulation,
Mm.
or untrue, or it's not going to last long, right? Because I also have a story around that. That's going to get yanked away at some point. And so that would be how I would read what was going on around me, right? And not even understand that I was playing into it.
And then when someone actually is treating you like garbage, then that totally fits, and that gets taken and
Validates.
put on the shelf, and there we go.
Well, actually, in another, but see, I'm not sure about that.
Oh, okay.
No, so I wouldn't mind exploring that, because there's something interesting in there, I think. Um, so like in my own case, no, I felt like I would feel unworthy and feel self-loathing. That's really the term I would use. And if someone did treat me that way, though, I would almost reflexively like fight against that. Like then I would have to put that person in their place. Especially like a non-threatening, like, so not in my family, but in my social environment where I was reaching out um, for the acceptance that I was seeking. If someone there rejected me, I could be really mean, um, and dress them down quite easily. And I think that's because they threatened to reveal
That's what I
what
was gonna say.
my insecurity, right? That self-loathing, and I could not show that to anyone.
Right. This is how I see myself, but don't you dare
I would reveal it.
reveal it or even point it out or say it, because that's, yeah, interesting. Yeah, because that's pretty that's typical, but I think that
I think
happens a lot, right? That when someone points out what we feel is our shortcoming, then we deny it or attack. And if we don't actually feel that's our shortcoming, then it's like, yeah, whatever.
you missed the mark.
Yeah, you missed some.
So,
I can see you saying that.
so the
Nice try, buddy. Why don't you go?
yeah, and so in the environment that I grew up in Timmins in Northern Ontario, there was a culture. So I'm not joking when, like, I mean, I sent you that article because I think it really,
Yeah.
for once, I agreed with something the Globe and Mail had to say. I had long felt that that city was full of like a lot of unresolved trauma. It was sort of a breeding ground for generational trauma, repeating it over and over. In it being a very remote, isolated community, not a lot of resources on hand, definitely an entrenched way of looking and experiencing the world from an extractive sort of or a mining sort of perspective, being the core industry.
I mean, you have said that before, that those kind of in one industry kind of places.
Yeah, the towns, the industry run towns that are very heavily resource based, they tend to be a little more rough and tumble.
Yeah, we suck everything out of you,
And give you enough money to go drink your nights away, you know? Yeah, so there was a culture there growing up that my friends and I sort of broke down over time as we got older and more mature. I do remember my brother saying to me shortly after leaving Timmins, when I was talking about still being in touch with some old friends. And he just commented, he's like, man, like, didn't you find the humor there like really mean?
and
And at the time I dismissed it. I was like, no, like, what are you, an idiot? And then
case in point.
and then in
Just
time
kidding.
breaking it down with my friends.
What does that mean? Breaking it down.
Well, we analyzed like, hey, did you ever think like how we were to one another was really mean? And it was like, oh yeah, absolutely. We all concurred. It was like, because our sense of camaraderie that we developed, it was through that mechanism that I was describing. Like, that's funny. I'm just realizing this now, the connection there. So you proved how close you were to your friends by how deeply you could cut to their vulnerability with your jokes in the group. So we were constantly picking at each other's insecurities as a matter of course. And
So
that's how we developed.
It was demonstrating how well you knew that person and how
In my
intimate you
twisted,
were.
this
You
is
were
in
with
my
them.
twisted mind. Yeah, at the
No,
time. Not everyone was like that. That's also to say not everyone was like that. I'm thinking now in hindsight, there was probably the more traumatized people were like that. With the biting kind of satire of other people and cutting to their insecurities. And it was a particular gift of mine. I'm not bragging about, but because I was highly sensitive.
It's interesting. I have a friend who's Irish, and he talks about that very, very similar way he described it. That the Irish
joke with one another.
Yeah, like the really hard-hitting humor.
Yeah, and that's a prevalent part of the culture there.
And right, another society that's been
heavily traumatized.
right.
Overrun how many times they so yeah, I was talking about defending. So there's the there's the people that respond. People get upset when you especially if you hit the mark, right? And you find that vulnerability, and they're like, "Don't you ever say that again?" Or I'm gonna pour this beer on your lap, and then I do it again, and he pours the beer on my lap, and then I can't help but laugh because he did warn me.
Okay,
So yeah,
have we strayed from the nervous system
yeah.
too
Well,
far?
not too far, no, because I think this
Okay.
comes back.
Okay,
so that's the narrative. So back to narrative.
Right, we're talking about narrative
So
identity.
we were talking about the narrative relationship to trauma in the body. Okay, so I've got all these stories And the stories continue to compile over time because they repeatedly have the same sort of reaction in certain situations. And that reaction is an overblown reaction based on, in my personal interpretation of the situation. So this is called a trigger. And then that starts to sort of become part of my story too, right? Well, yeah, when I get into these situations, and it becomes a clue. Like when I'm in this situation, I tend to have maybe overreactions. Maybe I'm overreacting. I don't know. And what I've learned from digging away at all this stuff is that basically, so in my own case, I had a nervous system that was high strung all the time. It was like hyper vigilance. And what I mean by that is that my body was so accustomed now to being triggered, or it was always kind of on that line, like it was ready to pop at any given moment because there's this slow cortisol sort of dump in my system, and there's always stress hormone in my body. And so it's not that I triggered easily, but as soon as I hit that red line, like I couldn't control it. I couldn't rein it in. And I think so like people with like PTSD, for instance, like they're quick to trigger, right? And there's like an anger. It's usually an angry outburst, um, and frenetic and overblown. When, say, someone who's been like lower level, like bullied constantly and had sort of low level ongoing stress.
Yeah.
Well, it's not like they jump right into the trigger. It can take a while to get to it, but it's constant and it's always there, and it's just kind of on edge. It's ready to go, and then you start adding any other stressors in the environment, and it'll come out pretty quick. So, in unpacking sort of the stories and looking at when the triggers happen, I came to understand like there's sort of an original story to where this all starts, right? Like what the trigger is, right? When you actually start analyzing the triggers, you could kind of get to the root of the original thing that hurt, right? Or caused the pain and sadness. And then in time, what I did was stuff that down before I was ever aware of it, right? I was stuffing it down and was taught in the environment I was in not to be super expressive, especially not to, not to exhibit sadness and tears and things like that. So as I got older, this all just became internalized, right? Like, so instead of a proper physiological response to the situation in the moment, again, this is pre having much control over the situation or even understanding the situation, that gets internalized, turns into a trigger over time. I'm on my daily life, I'm walking around looking for threats, basically, based on carrying this trigger around and being in hypervigilance with a constant dose of stress hormone. And when you're walking around looking for the specific threats, it doesn't take long to find them if that's what you're seeking out, if that's the lens that you're using in the environment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when it becomes like a repetitive pattern, right? So I think almost as people get older, you know how people can kind of get narrower and narrower and more locked into their sort of neurotic behaviors.
Right.
I think that's an indication of this, like, of
Grumpy
not.
grumpy old man kind of
Yeah,
curmudgeon.
and
Curmudgeon.
I think a lot is revealed in the stories that you will notice when you sit with people like this, that they keep coming back to the same thing. Like invariably, the stories all come around or come back to the same clues as to what's underlying whatever's grieving them.
Right.
But overall, the point of this is what I'm sharing. So like it's that overloaded nervous system that's seeking the threat in the environment, easily finds that threat in the environment, triggers, and then I'm going, what the hell just happened? Even though like I've set myself up to do this on a regular basis, unwittingly. Now, when I've explained it like this and shared this to my friends who are maybe experiencing similar things, or they're at least relating to what I'm saying, and going, yeah, that's it. Like when I get to that point, that anger, the outburst or whatever, like I don't get it. I don't know why it's happening. And I've laid it out in these terms. Okay, that actually sounds kind of like what I'm experiencing. It seems to be very close, like a facsimile, an approximation.
So their sense is recognizing that their response to the event is not necessarily on par with the event or the logical threat in the moment.
That's right.
So they're picking up on, they're noticing that.
Yeah, and they're at least relating to the way I'm expressing it, so that it obviously is, there's something to that in connection to their own experience of those outbursts, right? And the other thing I remind them of is like, as long as you're not being gaslit, if this is an ongoing pattern in your life, then that's a pretty good indication that you're onto something, right? Like look at that pattern and look at the story attached to it, what's going on there. Yeah, and the other, so people telling you this, when someone sits down and writes a letter and says, hey, I really care for you and you're an idiot for all these reasons, don't take it personally. Have a look at it, like consider what they're saying, right? Because they're noticing something in you
Hard not to, because then
that's out of character.
It's pretty hard not to look at it through that same lens.
Right. That's a good point.
Right. Oh, one more threat.
Yeah, right. How do you step out of that? Yeah. And then I also jumped into like, there's other like signals of your nervous system being out of whack, right? So you and I have talked about this before, but so the story, the narrative of like, all this stuff happened to me in the past, and then I get caught up in that thread of, man, all these horrible things happened to me. Like, oh man, I remember I was just really upset as a child, and when I can't stop thinking that way, that to me now that's an indication, right? That okay, I'm stuck in something here. Like I'm stuck in more than just a story. This is like my nervous system telling me there's something there to let go of. Because if my nervous system is drawing me back to this pattern, and it's like, oh God, I'm just trying to let go of the stress, the nervous system talking to me, right? Can you please just look at this and let it go and go cry it out in the corners?
Interesting. So how is your nervous system now?
Calm.
Okay. Oh, nice.
And anxiety being the future-oriented one, right? So seeking out the threats, the hypervigilance, so you start to see it everywhere, anticipating threats. So you're literally creating stress in your body for something that's not happening, and it's all in your mind.
Right.
I just wanted to throw that in because but I know you're going to ask a question and move on. So
okay. Well, are you interested in just kind of sharing how it went from always on, hypervigilant, to calm? What was that journey?
This is the part that gets, you and I have talked about this before. This is the part that gets a bit tricky. I had a very long journey, right, through our mental health system, doing outpatient clinics, trying my hand at a bunch of different things, which first introduced me to mindfulness through an outpatient clinic doing the dialectical behavior therapy,
Mm-hmm.
which did have it had an impact in the way of generating insight and starting to pay attention to these things differently than how I had been, seeking out clues or using them as clues. And then the therapeutic process, right, of going through the talk therapy. I still think that there was a component of like where I was just describing like nervous system almost generating depression as a means of getting you to focus on this emotional content. And it literally, like, if you look at the features of depression, it clouds out everything else. So you can't experience any emotion anywhere else. And you just got to look at this sadness. This is how I'm looking at it now. Like, it's as I'm going through this process of trying to describe this stuff. It's like, it's a weird thing. Like, so the therapeutic process helped really untangle a lot of that narrative and the stuff underlying the narrative identity that was attached to the depressive, self-loathing person. So that was a load on my nervous system that I was carrying around forever, right? For the duration of my existence.
What was the load?
That really profound sadness and that kept manifesting as like depression and stuff. But I wasn't expressing it. I wasn't expelling it. I wasn't having that visceral emotional experience of it. I wasn't letting it in. Wasn't welcoming it, Sean, as you taught me. So the talk therapy was really important in unwinding that and looking at it and sitting with it. More profoundly in doing the mindfulness.
Can I, before you go, so what was it about what did your talk therapy look like, and do you have any sense of what it was in that unraveled it?
I think the talk therapy setting was a very safe environment, given the right connection with the right person, because it took me a long time to really find someone that I was comfortable enough with.
Mm.
But to completely be open and share that stuff that I was too scared to be vulnerable and share with anyone, for fear of judgment or someone agreeing with my poor assessment of myself. So you pay an advocate, right? You pay a personal advocate to basically affirm your sad story. But it was a safe place to be in exploring the story, but also experiencing whatever emotions came up,
Mm-hmm.
and being able to experience it viscerally, to embrace it and to let it in and just sit with it and be okay with whatever emotions were arising. I'd say that was the benefit of it. I know going through these cycles of, I think I talked to you about that one point in the therapeutic experience when we sort of got to like a point where it's obvious that we'd cut through all the surface layer stuff. And then there was a point where it was like, yeah, there's one last thing, I've got this like black hole at the center of my heart.
Yes.
And she's like, oh, can you close your eyes and tell me what that is? It's like, I don't really want to do that. And once I ventured there, I know I was scared to death, and I ran away for months, and I did not want to go back to that. I'm guessing this is around the time, pretty close to the time I met you. That was right around that time in the therapeutic experience that I was touching the void, and then I ran away from it and went back to the original person and said, all right, what were we doing again? And what that initiated was like I don't have words to really accurately capture this. A primal, it felt like a primal release of, or sorry, let me rephrase this. It felt like the release and the expression of some like primal grief. It was unlike anything I had felt or expressed before, and it was frightening. It was really scary because it felt like it was completely out of control. Like it was, there's nothing, I couldn't put a cork back on it. And there are times I just wanted to scream at the top of my lungs, but I was in a house and it was midnight. And I couldn't do that, or I'd get taken away to the bin. And it sort of cycled through, you know, these expressions, these of the primal grief, and then a long, well, long relatively. Let's say like after the first release, there was like a 2 month kind of depression, and then over the course of about a year, it was like these waves of emotions. I would have a release, and it would be a shorter window of time that I would sink back into a like a depressed sort of state, and then I'd go through another wave, and the waves gradually started to diminish. Like the intensity of that experience started to diminish until it got to the point where nothing was coming out anymore, and I would say that kind of exhausted that well of primal grief, like that sense of overwhelming sadness, whatever it was.
How did you ride out the depressive phases?
Well, this is when you and I were beginning to work together. So it was like reinforcing in the therapeutic setting. I was encouraged to sit with it. Just, you know, don't fight off the experience. Just let it in. I mean, like, yeah, right. Like, easy for you to say. You don't have to deal with the next 2 months. When I was, so then when I actually started doing the work with you, you know, you took me in an indirect route to being more comfortable sitting with discomfort, right? Direct in the way you presented it, but indirect as to how it related to what I was experiencing at the time. So in the process of doing our sits and just reflecting on how fleeting every experience seemed to be. Similarly with the mindfulness mind exercises as well, from whether it's observing breath to those examples I'd shared with you, right, where you picture yourself in a setting and you're just observing what comes up and letting it go. That, you know, I feel, because I still remember the time. I remember when it happened, that we kept pulling on these threads, right? So I was pulling on the threads of the narrative identity in the counselor, like in the therapeutic setting. And then you and I were pulling on the threads of identity, just generally, right? And it was the culmination. I can't disentangle all these threads.
Yes.
But they did disentangle, and I remember that that story I had of who I was, that I strongly identified with, that was attached to a lot of that self-loathing and negativity and pain and lashing out at the world in my own way. I felt that literally like like it felt like it unraveled like it was a cloak I had been wearing my whole life, and like it just came undone and fell off. And I was like, uh-oh. Um,
Who the hell am I?
yeah, who the hell am I? And why did I do this again? And it was terrible. Again, it was it was a scary experience. That's what I felt was fear and felt alienation and went through all the ups and downs of floating through the world, suddenly no longer having that anchor of identity that I was very familiar with and interacting with people, regaling them with all the stories of who I am because I love stories. And but with that came a deep sense of calm, unlike I have ever experienced. I've had moments of tranquility in my life, but I never had a lasting experience of it. And I can say now, because I've had enough time in this current incarnation, to say that like that sense of calm, I believe, is a settled nervous system, because I'm no longer drawn to examine the grief of my past, i.e. depression, and I'm no longer drawn into the future, concerned in my mind with a bunch of threats that are not there presently. And just taking those two things out of the equation has led to, I believe, my nervous system now being calm. So when the same events can arise that triggered me in the past, I may still have a reaction to them, but it's not at the intensity or the level that I did previously, where I'm suddenly out of it, like where the observer is just looking, going, what the hell's going on here? Like, why is your heart up to 120 beats a minute suddenly, and you're dumping adrenaline? What's going on? And acting out in some, well, just acting out. Just leave it at that.
Is there any sense when you observe that of any need of having to do anything about it?
No, I would say that's an explicit difference from how I was before and how I am now. And in the reaction before was, like when I think of a trigger, the trigger is literally trying to create a sense of control or security, right? If you feel the fear or the threat internally, you're going to project out and try to control the situation. So you're either controlling the other person by, say, maybe diminishing them, or trying to frighten them, or basically telling them to go away in a very explicit and nasty way. Or you're trying to create the security, right? Like clear them out of the way. Like, just get out of here. You're threatening. This isn't working for me right now. You need to go. You're the problem. Right. I don't have now. There's more just like my default, which is like curiosity. I'm able to train that on the situation a little better. It seems to be a lot more effective, and it's not about then taking a reactionary position. It's just curious. What's going on here? Um, Especially if someone else is in a trigger now. Um, it seems to me, not that I can't say that I've done a ton of this, but since, but yeah, I'm not feeling my own triggers or my nervous system throwing up any sort of threat alert in those situations. I'm just able to be very calm and curious about the situation.
Well, your heart's at 120, is that?
Well, no, that's the thing, because I'm not getting, I don't get agitated like that anymore.
Oh, that doesn't happen.
No, no, no.
Oh,
No, I'm
I
talking
see.
like, so if someone else is triggered and I enter a situation, I'm less likely to get elevated.
Hmm. So you find things don't trigger you anymore? Is that what you're saying?
No, no, not necessarily. I would say that the triggers are just like barely noticeable now. Like it's like okay, so like problems as I see them don't go away, right? Things continue to happen that are going to be potentially very stressful. I guess my nervous system though has enough leeway now that it can detect, or sorry, I can detect now in advance when I'm feeling stress. And you know, this the first kind of indication is, oh, there's a tinge of anxiety there. What am I feeling anxious about?
So there's enough space and there's enough downtime that when there's uptime, or no, that's or when there's what are they called in science? There's some kind of, I guess we'll say, activity in the nervous system that it's actually can be noticed as different and be able to be observed or felt, or you kind of
Yeah,
hang out with it.
hang out with it, be curious about it, and then also even just see like, oh, I'm noticing this cycle of thoughts that I'm cycling through something right now. Why am I cycling through these thoughts? Why does this keep coming up? Oh, I'm kind of fixated on, I don't know, my 2 weeks of vacation is up and I have to go back to work. Now that used to be a stressful experience for me. It's like, oh, I
Yeah.
gotta go back in there. It's really stressful. Go back there. And now, like I noticed that there's like a familiarity in that pattern coming out. Like, oh, you gotta go back to work. And then I was almost immediately like, yeah, I don't care. Like, you know, there's probably a bunch of stuff that isn't done, and I'm gonna put in some extra time on that day, and I don't need that stress right now. No, yeah, okay.
It's just that advisor giving you some guidance. So this is going to be happening. You should be
Yeah,
worried about. You should be worried about this.
you should worry about this. Start getting wound up now. And
No, I'm good.
yeah, and it's funny. Like I had a joke with a colleague. I was like, yeah, I think I was getting more anxiety about anticipating having anxiety.
Exactly. Yeah. But it just to go back to like that's really interesting what you point out. I don't know if I that because for the average person, I would say that the nervous system is just so on, right? That and I've experienced with that with people that I start working with mindfulness with, whether in groups or individually, that they're not even really able to notice, right? And to me, it's like, oh, you can't kind of notice that, and that's why, like, even one of the beginning things and one of the programs I use is just starts with the the body's like the muscle relaxation technique.
Yeah,
Right? And
it's
people are
really
like,
cool.
why are we doing this? And it's just like it's having to just start with just the bare bones basic. He's training your system. Like I'll even say like that, like typically it's going on in our chest, our throat, our gut, or our head, right? And there's all these other parts of our body that are actually fairly calm, and we're not even aware of that, just because so much bandwidth. is being taken up. And like, I like how you put it, that when that bandwidth with activity, active bandwidth gets, it's not the bandwidth, but the the actual activity gets brought to a reasonable level, then and it's almost like
Excuse me.
that's kind of, that's the nervous system just kind of probably how it was intended to do its job, right? And people think that, well, I'll never get there, right? Thinking that this is some kind of very high level of achievement, when it's nothing. All you're doing is you're just shaving off all the extra stuff and just allowing your nervous system to just function in its regular
Just
state.
relax. Yeah, and it's I think that's primarily why I've come to this conclusion about it, and that's because I didn't know it any other way either, right? Like, to experience life racked with anxiety and depression, among other things, is like, that's the only frame you know, or the only lens you know.
Yeah, and
And
that's
you're right in starting with the most bare bones observation of the body, that there's still going to be one that's still going to be fixated on, like, well, yeah, my heart's going a mile a minute, like, I think I'm having a heart attack. And this is why I'm saying openly now to friends, when I see them,
yeah.
you're just having, like, you're having a panic attack. It's anxiety. It's your nervous system shot. Like, you're running on overdrive for like 800 kilometers now. So just
Yeah, and that's, I think, is the most difficult, not most difficult, but one of the difficult is that for someone that hasn't known anything else, to actually give them an inkling that there's another way of being. And I think it's kind of a gift for people who have known you, I guess, when you were right, to say, wow, this guy was how I am, and now he's not, and I don't know if he's that special.
yeah, right. Yeah, no, actually, I'm not. I'm really not. You can do this too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the sorry, I'm getting a cramp here. Yeah, and there's also, like, if you just consider the strictures of modern life, like, once you get to a certain stage in life, 30s, 40s, 50s, 40s, 50s, you're locked into your mortgage, you hoping to see the finish line sometime off in the distance, and you got to get this shit paid down, and only so many more years that I got to work at this level, and I mean, I see it with all my professional friends around me who are just like, gotta go, gotta get while the getting's good. I don't know when this is all gonna stop. I'm looking at maybe it's time you stop. Like, you take a break.
Good
Just
stuff,
stand
Stu.
back for a minute. Just a minute. Try to start with a minute, like I did. 1 minute a week.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's, to me, is eventually the place that a person really, I wouldn't say need to, but it's helpful to come to, that, to seeing how seeing that narrative actually of not just the narrative of them and their chaos, but also just the bigger narrative and how maybe that identity that they've been fed from the day they were born, maybe it's not quite as legitimate as they've been led to believe. Because I think one can meditate or whatever, do mindfulness. But if one is doing mindfulness so that they can become a better producer, right? And get more
done, more stuff.
more stuff done than
We need more stuff.
yeah.
Well, but even if that was the impetus to them trying it out, then so be it.
Yeah,
I
definitely.
Think of Hale. Find peace and happiness forever. Achieve your dreams.
Yeah, get more money, career, get the perfect spouse. Come on down, we'll get you that. And then he gets in there.
Nothing's happening. Nothing's really going on.
Can you actually find anyone there that is going to get any of those things? All right, is there any more around that? I was maybe gonna.
The only
stop
I think
recording.
two things I'd like to circle back to. One circle back and then one additional point. Just yeah, and how you describe to the focus, like the bandwidth of the of our attention and how it's going to be focused on these intensely uncomfortable points, right? Where we're storing our stress, and that, in a sense, we come to identify with that this is normal. And it's just because I'm dealing with all this stuff in the environment. That it's tremendously relieving. Like in my experience, when I was able to release that, let go of that, it really did create the space. Like it opened up space for me that I've never felt before, to just to be with things as they roll in and not have to plan or deflect, or the amount of energy it takes to keep stuff down. It's remarkable. And when you let go of that, there's the amount of energy that you're freeing up, not necessarily to go and take up downhill biking or something, but just to have that energy that seems to expand into awareness, right? From my perspective. And the other being, it just brings me back to that point too about crisis, that it seems to be a great opportunity when people are in crisis to tap their shoulders and say, hey, who's paying attention? Right? It seems to be a good entry point, because that's when the narrative is sort of coming to an end, or it's hit a wall.
Okay. All right. Oh, you're gonna need to get more. Wait, so tap them on the shoulder. Who's paying attention?
Who's paying attention right now? That was just a joke. I'm sorry, I'm joking on
to the crisis.
Your types of questions. No, who's actually experiencing this right now?
Oh,
You're questioning, pointing inward. It's a great opportunity to introduce them to something like mindfulness, right? When all their other options have ceased to work or help them function.
Yeah. Might have to give up some stuff, but come on in.
Oh man. Yeah, I think that's a good place to end. I don't have anything to add.
Okay.